Hey, Jarvis, here we are again on a sunny summer Friday afternoon in Zoomlandia. And this is fun to be together again in this format because we've decided that we have a good time talking to each other, first of all.
Right.
We've really enjoyed all of the conversations that we've been having this past month. And yet August has been a pretty crazy month, hasn't it, with things that are going on in the world. Indictments, and we're dealing with horrible fires in Hawaii and first of the presidential debates that have kicked off. So, I mean, people who think about issues of democracy and of how our governance is working are probably pulled in 1,000 different directions of what to be focusing on. And at a recent staff meeting, we decided we wanted to also bring forward something else that happened this month, which was the Alabama Brawl. Right. And why we felt it was important to have a sense-making conversation about that significant cultural thing that happened in our country. And had a really good discussion internally, I think, in this way that we're committed to sense making together about issues that affect us as a country. And so we decided that we wanted to have that conversation for an external audience as well. So thanks for coming onto the screen again with me.
Well, there is so many conversations that have been had about this issue, and yet we have engineered a practice in the country where we can have conversations about all these important topics, but race still makes us kind of uncomfortable. And so I'm glad that we get a chance to do what we do at Horizons, and that is try to figure out what's going on in those deep reservoirs of meaning that we draw from to understand our world and how we should show up, and to explore what sometimes is beneath the surface of our public conversations, those deep ideas that animate us, haunt us, shame us, embolden us. I'm excited.
Well, so let's frame the conversation initially. So if people here are listening to us and you do not know what we're talking about, you should Google the Alabama Brawl.
Right.
There was an incident that happened along the Alabama River that involved two boats and an altercation, and it was dramatic. And I think part of the reason that it's captured the zeitgeist, not only for the place where it happened, the birthplace of the civil rights movement, but also a place where enslaved people were taken off of boats. I mean, there's so much weight to the actual place of the altercation that when a Black man who was a co-captain of the riverboat was asking someone to move their pontoon boat that happened to be filled with a group of white people, and then was attacked, violently attacked, threw his hat up in the air, which was this, of course, also very dramatic moment of a call for help and people answering the call for help. And then along racial lines, about 24 people getting involved of having a violent altercation. It was eventually broken up by the police. And the folks on the pontoon boat that threw the first punches were arrested. And the reason I wanted to have this conversation is because, you know, I am on TikTok all the time, and I'm very much on the racial justice side of TikTok. And so I get a lot of that commentary and content creators discussing. And there's just been this outpouring celebration of a moment. First of all, justice being served because the folks were arrested.
Right.
And also a community coming together to help each other effectively. And of course, there was comedic elements. There's a folding chair that's involved.
Right.
And then a lot of memes with the folding chair and Black Aquaman. It was a dramatic moment.
Right.
And yet there's such a racialized tension involved, and questions about whether this should have been prosecuted as a hate crime or not, which it eventually was not. So as someone who cares deeply about nonviolence me, Julia Roig, grappling with a violent moment and the celebration of that violent moment. I'm wondering where you were coming from when we just jumped into it together.
No, absolutely. I'll talk from my vantage point in terms of someone who has attempted to think about racial issues, try to think responsibly about them, and the way that our practice of dealing with racial conflict in this country has left us unprepared to have so many of the conversations we have to have. So I think for me, I was so appreciative, Julia, of the way in which you spoke to the concern that everyone had already given voice or kind of alluded that was on their mind. We can't avoid this moment without learning to be in conversation with each other. So I think I'll start there saying it's radical to even open up our hearts and minds to be curious together about this. And if and as any takeaways could be given, the audacity to talk about this concept, the way it haunts us, animates our behavior, compromises our institutions, compromises our faith beliefs, and it's something we got to work on. And we're not going to get there being passive about the conversation.
So it seems that there's kind of two aspects of engaging with this event that happened in Montgomery, which did force a national conversation for a really short time.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
it got a lot of media attention. There's a lot of videos.
Yeah.
And then kind of dissipated because of a lot of competing things in the zeitgeist, but it didn't dissipate for everybody. So I think where the conversations are happening still and where they're not is telling. And I think there's two aspects to the conversation. One is, why do we always have to make everything about race?
Right.
That it just happened to be a group of Black people fighting
Right.
white people.
Right.
And it's a brawl. I mean, brawls happen all the time. It was like a daily life moment of people on a boat that didn't move.
Right.
Yet the other aspect of the conversation is the violence of standing up for someone who is being attacked effectively. And someone I read literally said, this was the best fight I've ever seen. How many people were cheering this on? And you really felt it. You feel the poignancy and meaningfulness of that moment.
Historically, I think there has been a challenge in articulating the way a particular community who has a history, and this is where African Americans are unique here, they have a history of being enslaved here. And so how have they tried to fight for justice? And the rituals of racial interaction so oftentimes show Blacks, African Americans, depending on how you want to characterize them, enduring violence at the hands of government officials, at the hands of mobs, at the hands of just random white observers, and having to endure it in the name of some moral principle. That somehow we were demonstrating that we didn't deserve it by withstanding it without responding to it. And that has not always been the history. So there are all kinds of texts that would show that there's always been creative resistance. There's been opportunities where even using violence to stop violence from being used against them is a part of our narrative. But America struggles to see that. And there's a lot of reasons I would imagine explain that. But I think it's hard to get to why, to your point, this conversation is resonating in certain communities, specifically communities who have an allegiance to this long story of fighting for justice in African American communities. I think it doesn't go without consideration that in this country, usually we African American struggles, and those who are trying to be a part of that struggle usually have to endure violence in order to get some form of change. Being from Mississippi, knowing that story of Emmett Till and how vigilantes came and took him from his home or the home he was residing in, that story animates this conflict. it's this conflict of always having to hope justice might show up and never knowing for sure that it will. I think it's also useful to think about the reflections we saw from those who witnessed the murdering of George Floyd and this conversation that we're having as a nation. What are the requirements of the bystander? What should you do when injustice is unfolding on your watch? And do the means we have to respond to certain moments, are they sufficient when we witness gross injustices? Mm-hmm. And I think this is also a part of a larger conversation of people who want to push our narrative forward, white, black, of all colors. And we're trying to reclassify what authentic agency looks like. And I think that also animated what we witnessed, not just on racial lines, but America attempting to no longer participate in George Floyd moments as innocent bystanders, no longer wanting to watch injustice and just sit there. But I think for the nonviolent community, that is our challenge now, because we have to try to be authentic and strategic about how we practice pursuing justice and what role violence and nonviolence has to play in those considerations.
Yeah, and I think in this case too, there's a dynamic of the rule of law and the rule of justice.
Yeah.
And I think you had brought up a good point when we were talking internally about the fact that had this not turned into a brawl, had it not been filmed, and the police had shown up, and there had just been one person who had been attacked, what the experience might have been, what it could have been different. And so we, of course, think about law and order as such an important part of democracy. And yet we also talk about negative peace being a peace without justice. So I think that the cathartic nature of the entire event was also how it ended. With feeling like justice had been served in the name of the law.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate that it is a celebratory moment when justice actually is pursued in a way that is equally respective of color and class and creed. I think the jubilation that we witness also tells a story of a people who have been grossly underserved by the systems of justice. And when that internalization of systemic injustice takes root, where you no longer can depend on justice systems to actually serve justice, it's unfortunate that it's surprising when we actually see justice overcome our racial biases. And so I think that's a win for Alabama. I think that's a win for people who are trying to reach for justice. And I think it's a concerning note of those who care about our institutions that we have allowed institutional injustice to endure, that justice surprises us.
Yeah. So we wanted to reflect on why we felt this was so important for us to talk about within Horizon's work. One is just to acknowledge, as you were saying in the beginning, we have to have tense conversations. We have to step into them. I felt sad about a moment of celebrating violence, just as a lifetime of peace building.
Sure.
And yet I felt that it was also really important to understand why that celebration was happening.
Right.
And to then be able to step into that historic context, the social context of the moment, and the reason that the conversation around race must continue as a part of our conversation around democracy. Yes. And at Horizons, we are at 1,000% committed to ensuring that that conversation isn't lost. That's why we wanted to put forward the need for an ongoing grappling with the intersection of nonviolence in our movement spaces, de-escalation practices when we see violence unfolding, bystander responsibility when
Mhm.
you see injustices, and modeling the way that we can have hard conversations. And that's really important to us at Horizons, and we'll bring others into the conversation as well.
Absolutely. I cannot be more excited to think about democracy and have race baked into those reflections, not because we have the answer, but because we are curious about the questions and trying to learn and trying to listen and trying to be vulnerable. So it's interesting that even the interview we had a few months ago, where we were talking about, how do you connect people together and what's this connective tissue look like? And these are conversations that help that connective tissue last and build it. And I know sometimes it seems insurmountable to overcome these racial challenges, but one thing's for sure, we won't get there if we don't talk.
Mm.
And I have been committed to having conversations about it, but it's even more refreshing when we can make talking about it the normal commitment of doing democracy. It's 2023, and we're still acting as if we have a choice to not confront race. I'm exceedingly joyful that, Julia, we're on the same journey of trying to build this democracy. And for us, and for those of our partners and people who are actively organizing, whether they explicitly deal with race or not is not the point, but that they know racism is something that continues to need to be addressed and thought about. That's, to me, that's the best ticket to this democracy I want to live in.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned, because we're going to continue to experiment with this format, aren't we? Right? You and I have said not everybody likes reading a blog,
Right, right.
but maybe they'll listen to a short video. And so we're going to keep trying to have these conversations in this format. And I'm so glad to have a willing partner with you, Jarvis. This has been really great.
Absolutely. Yes, it's been a treat for me as well.